The room fell silent.
Are you out of your mind?
John Smith pushed me away, cursing repeatedly.
Mr. Brown, even if I'm not interested in you, there's no need to humiliate this gentleman.
Emily Johnson frowned, pulling my visibly upset friend aside and looking down at me. I wiped the blood from my lips and gave her a smile.
Sorry, I've been a bit unruly since I was a kid, developed some quirks, and just enjoy playing rough.
The implication was clear. I was calling John Smith a dog.
David Brown, this isn't cool, is it? We're good friends. Do you really need to embarrass me in front of everyone over this?
When we were eating, you were rubbing your foot under Emily Johnson's skirt. Was it because of an itch?
I turned to Emily Johnson.
In the restroom, you leaned on John Smith while using the facilities. Couldn't you find a suitable toilet? Do you think I'm blind?
The surrounding onlookers began to whisper, their gazes towards John Smith filled with either mockery or disdain.
Wow, a real-life drama unfolding today.
Hitting on your buddy's girl, what a low move.
Flies don't land on seamless eggs. That girl looks pretty, but who knew she was so fickle?
Ha ha. If I were better looking, would I be the one getting hit on? Ha ha.
Listening to the rising tide of ridicule around him, John Smith's face turned as dark as coal, the veins in his neck becoming more prominent. Still, he maintained the facade of an innocent, wrong gentleman in front of everyone.
David Brown, this is our first time meeting for a date. I didn't expect you to be so disrespectful, spreading rumors about others. With such low character, I don't think we need to continue this conversation.
She pulled out a household registration book from her exquisite Chanel handbag, holding it between her slender fingers, and faced the crowd.
John Smith and I fell in love at first sight. I will marry no one but him, and we're getting our marriage certificate today. As for you, you're not even fit to be a guard for the Johnson family.
Emily Johnson's bold declaration of love drew many admiring glances.
The Johnson family of Linhai, the one that topped the Horwin Rich list for 5 consecutive years.
Oh my, this is a real wealthy family. That guy is so lucky.
What do you mean lucky? This is like the reincarnation of Wendy Dang.
The eldest daughter of the Johnson family. No wonder she's so beautiful. I wonder if I could be her driver.
Listening to the crowd's praise, John Smith's expression improved significantly. Emily Johnson quickly moved to cling to John Smith's arm, casually placing the household registration book aside, and resumed her elegant demeanor.
How is this possible? Aren't you just an ordinary college student? How could you be from the Johnson family of Linhai?
Emily Johnson snorted, quickly shaking off my hand in disgust, her tone contemptuous.
You men are all the same, only after my looks.
Pretending to be heartbroken, I swiftly grabbed the household registration book from the table.
I will never let you two get married.
Amidst the stunned gazes of everyone, I quickly fled the restaurant. After leaving the house, David Brown headed straight to the convenience store and purchased a kitchen knife. He then hailed a taxi.
Driver, quick to Garden Community Building 1, as fast as you can.
Young man, that's halfway across the province. My fuel costs.
Impatiently, David pulled out a wad of cash and slapped it onto the front seat.
All right, let's go.
The driver immediately shut up, stepped on the gas, and sped off like a rocket. Sitting in the bumpy car, David opened his phone and set a countdown timer for a specific moment. The clear sound of the countdown began. His tense nerves started to relax, and he finally felt the reality of his rebirth.
In my previous life, John Smith was alone and helpless. My family kindly took him in, and I foolishly treated him like a brother.
In their senior year of college, David's dad wanted to introduce him to a smart and lively girl from his company.
At the matchmaking dinner, Emily Johnson fell for my good buddy John Smith at first sight. She immediately cozied up to him to get a marriage certificate.
Emily Johnson turned out to be the illegitimate daughter of the Johnson family from the coast. Soon, she was to return to the Johnson family as an heir. When David's dad learned that John Smith had connected with the Johnson family's eldest daughter, he immediately called David.
David, don't come home. Here's a few $1,000s. Make your own way.
David's dad recognized John Smith as his son instead. That's when David found out that John Smith, whom he had considered a good brother for so long, was actually his dad's illegitimate son.
Under the guise of taking in a friend's orphan, my dad brought John Smith into our home, providing him with good food and drink for 18 years. To my dad, the significance of having two sons was merely a retirement plan.
Whoever could provide him with wealth and comfort in his old age was his good son. Emily Johnson chose John Smith, so David's dad abandoned him.
But he didn't realize that the identity of an illegitimate son had haunted John Smith for 18 years. How could he possibly accept it?
On the day John Smith got the marriage certificate with Emily Johnson, he set fire to the house to destroy evidence of his origins. David's mom was severely injured trying to save his dad.
John Smith, with Emily Johnson's connections, infiltrated the upper circles of the coastal city and became the godson of a self-made millionaire. Only then did the Johnson family reluctantly accept him as their son-in-law.
David's dad was so enraged that he lost his mind and was sent to a mental hospital. All the family assets had been transferred to John Smith's name. He didn't leave them a single penny. David and his mom were forced to live in the slums.
I was penniless and hadn't graduated yet. I searched everywhere for a job, but faced constant rejection. I finally found a sales job at a nightclub.
Because one of John Smith's new friends was there, they framed David for making advances on a Big Shot's partner. They, along with the Big Shot's bodyguards and the nightclub's thugs, dragged him to an alley without surveillance and beat him up.
That night, I was utterly defenseless, beaten to within an inch of my life.
Before David passed out, John Smith, dressed in custom-made designer clothes, came to see him, smiling elegantly.
David Brown, your mother knew you got beaten up for making advances on a woman and was trembling as she went around borrowing money. She got hit by a car and ended up in the hospital. She passed away a few days ago, and you're still clinging to life here. If I were you, I'd have gone to join her by now.
What had my family ever done to offend him?
David Brown, get this straight. I'm the protagonist. How can an NPC like you overshadow me? I've got the protagonist system. Wherever I go, I'm the main character. How can you compete with me?
Compete? When had I ever competed with you?
To David's good brother, he had always been just a disposable NPC. The so-called kindness of raising him, the so-called brotherhood, was nothing more than a pre-programmed sequence, worthless. Even being better than him had become an original sin.
In this life, I will protect my family and never repeat the same mistakes.
By the time I arrived at the community, it was already 4 in the afternoon. I sprinted home at a speed of 800 meters per minute, rushing through the door. As soon as I pushed it open, the familiar aroma of chestnut braised black chicken greeted me.
David, weren't you supposed to be on a blind date at the university town today? Why are you back home?
Seeing her familiar face, I couldn't hold back my emotions any longer and rushed to hug her tightly.
Mom! I missed you.
Oh dear, you're such a big boy now, but still so hasty.
In my past life, I was too timid to protect you well. This time, I will make it up to you. But before I could relish the moment, a familiar voice came from behind me.
David, you're back from the blind date?
I calmed down and turned to see Mr. Brown, who had just returned from work. His face was beaming, his eyes shining as if I were some extraordinary treasure.
Quick, tell me, what did Emily Johnson think of you?
Emily Johnson didn't fancy me. she likes someone else.
Mr. Brown's face instantly darkened. He roughly threw his briefcase onto the table and started pacing back and forth in agitation.
Useless. I've raised you all these years, and you can't even win over a woman? Do you know who Emily Johnson is? Do you know how hard I worked to find out? You're driving me mad.
Mrs. Brown, bewildered, quickly shielded me.
Old man, what's gotten into you? If it didn't work out, it didn't work out. Our son is only in his senior year of college, with a bright future ahead. He's young and handsome, there will be plenty of gentle girls for him in the future. Why must it be that Johnson girl?
Overindulgent mothers spoil their sons. He's been ruined by your pampering.
He pulled out his phone and forcefully grabbed my hand.
Call Emily Johnson right now and beg her for another date. You must make her like you. Otherwise, you're not fit to be my son, John Smith.
I coldly brushed his hand away. Without hesitation, I tossed the phone into the trash. John Smith was stunned for 3 seconds before he reacted. His face turned red as he looked at David in disbelief.
This is outrageous. I swear I'll deal with you today, you ungrateful child.
David, annoyed, pulled a brand new kitchen knife out of his backpack and slammed it onto the table with a loud clang.
Come on.
John's raised hand froze in midair. David sneered, knowing John's bluster was just a facade. Mrs. Brown, startled by David's actions, quickly tried to mediate.
David, your father has been very busy and stressed lately. That's why he got so angry just now. You're just a youngster, why are you getting mad at your father? Put the knife away.
David was about to respond when a voice came from behind.
Mr. Brown, I'm really sorry. David was nervous about his first blind date today, so I went to give him some support. But the girl said she liked me and decided to marry me.
David paused in the act of putting away the knife, looking coldly at the newcomer.
Damn it, this guy just won't go away.
The newcomer met David's icy gaze with an innocent smile and continued.
David, I'm sorry. Even though I'm your brother, you can't force feelings. Please return Emily Johnson's household registration book to her.
John's expression changed, momentarily stunned.
Household registration book?
I didn't want them to get married, so I took Emily Johnson's household registration book back. Is there a problem?
John, not realizing the seriousness, habitually scolded David.
You're being ridiculous.
He then turned to the newcomer, his face lighting up with joy.
Emily Johnson actually likes you. It seems David just isn't lucky. John, we're all family. Why are you apologizing? Come in and have lunch.
The newcomer shook his head, a hint of smugness in his eyes.
No need, Mr. Brown. I'll leave after taking the household registration book. Emily's driver is still waiting outside to take me to the Johnson family dinner.
John's eyes lit up immediately.
Is that so? John, see if you can take Mr. Brown with you. It's your first time attending such a grand family dinner, and you can't afford to make any mistakes. Without an elder to look after you, I'm afraid you won't manage.
The newcomer's smile became slightly awkward, looking at John with a hint of disdain.
Mr. Brown, I don't need anyone to accompany me. I'll just pack my things and leave.
With that, he lifted his leg to step inside. David raised the knife and slammed it onto the threshold, eyes fierce.
John Smith, listen to me. You've been freeloading in our house for 18 years, living off our money. Now I'm telling you, there's nothing here that belongs to you, and Emily Johnson's household registration book isn't yours either. You can get lost.
David slammed the door shut with a loud bang, then turned back to John, still holding the knife.
I'm not giving him the household registration book. If you want to open the door and let him in, I'll make sure this knife sees some action today.
John was complete. David ignored him and pulled Mrs. Brown into his room.
Mom, John Smith is Dad's illegitimate child.
Mrs. Brown was shocked. She raised her hand to touch David's forehead.
David, have you been through something traumatic?
If you don't believe me, go check the drawer in the middle of the wardrobe. There's a birth certificate and a DNA test report. His genetic similarity with Dad is 98.9%.
Half an hour later, Mrs. Brown stared at the two documents on the table, silent for a long time.
Avid handed Mrs. Brown a tissue.
David, you're decisive. Tell me, what should I do to help you?
The main event was about to begin.
Avid took a deep breath and pulled out a plastic bag containing a piece of skin from John Smith's lip and some hair.
We have 5 hours left, Mom. We need to move immediately. Also, please take care of this for me.
Without hesitation, Mrs. Brown quickly called Aunt Mary, who was in the real estate business. Soon, they secured a spacious apartment, fully furnished and ready for immediate move-in.
Avid checked the time.
2 hours left. We should make it.
He took a deep breath, grabbed a pack of cigarettes, and headed to the property management office of the garden community.
Avid handed out cigarettes to everyone inside.
Hey, we've been losing things at home lately. Is your security work not up to par?
The young man at the front desk accepted a cigarette, his eyes lighting up. He quickly brought David a cup of coffee and smiled warmly.
What did you lose? We'll have the security room check the surveillance right away.
It's not anything major, just some concerns about the security system in our community.
David fiddled with the lighter in his hand.
Also, it's the hottest days of summer. I heard that an old neighborhood nearby had a fire because a cigarette butt fell on a pile of cardboard in a rental house. We don't want something like that happening here.
The young man's expression turned serious at the mention of safety.
That won't happen here. All our tenants are registered, and we conduct regular visits.
That's good.
David thought for a moment, then pulled out a stack of cash from his bag and smiled innocently.
We'll be away for a couple of days, and there's no one to take care of our cats and dogs. Could you help feed them?
The young man's eyes gleamed, and he immediately promised.
Our service is always thorough. You can rest assured.
Before leaving, David looked at the young man meaningfully and said slowly,
Don't forget, tonight.
Mrs. Brown was indeed quick. Before 9 o'clock, we had already packed up and moved to our new home. The next morning, without bothering to eat the breakfast Mrs. Brown had prepared, I hailed a taxi and headed back to school. Just as I entered the school gate, a basketball landed right in front of me. I looked up and it seemed familiar. Wasn't this the ball of that jock who always followed Emily Johnson around? At some point, a crowd had gathered ahead, making a lot of noise. When I saw what was happening, I let out a cold laugh. It was indeed that ridiculous couple. Emily Johnson and John Smith had just stepped out of a car, surrounded by a group of bodyguards, making their entrance into the university campus more grandiose than a celebrity's. Emily Johnson was wearing an extremely extravagant and luxurious low-cut feather evening gown, her fair and slender legs exposed, and her delicate face was truly captivating. John Smith, in a perfectly tailored white suit, looked as handsome as a movie star, with a faint, aloof smile on his face and his hair neatly combed back, walking with an air of arrogance. No wonder he had the male lead aura. A group of basketball players and onlookers on the playground all gaped in unison.
Bang!
However, just as John Smith was basking in the admiring gazes of the crowd, he suddenly cursed, unable to maintain his smile. A stray ball had hit his pristine white suit, leaving a yellow stain, with a swarm of buzzing flies hovering around it. But what really broke him was the sight of several solid lumps rolling down from his chest. The crowd quickly dispersed, unable to bear the stench. Emily Johnson stepped aside in a hurry, screaming.
Who threw this?
A few sharp-eyed bystanders pointed to the jock who had thrown the basketball at me.
It's his basketball.
The jock, terrified, waved his hands frantically and pointed at me.
The basketball is mine, but he threw the stuff.
John Smith immediately spotted me in the crowd, struggling to maintain his gentlemanly demeanor.
David Brown. Just because Miss Xiao didn't fancy you and preferred me, does that mean you have to target me like this? Have you forgotten our brotherly bond?
I made no effort to hide my actions, placing the cat poop bag I was holding on the ground and looking at him defiantly.
Yes, I threw it. So what?
John Smith opened his mouth to speak, but a fly took the opportunity to fly in, causing his face to turn a shade of purple. Seeing this, Emily Johnson glared at me angrily, and her bodyguards began to close in on me. Did they really think I was someone to be easily bullied? I sneered, pulling out a kitchen knife from my bag, ready to teach this despicable couple a lesson. At that moment, a middle-aged man jumped out, one hand pressing down on my knife and the other pushing away the bodyguards, forcibly ending the farce. The man, nearing 50, exuded an air of scholarly elegance and authority. He was none other than Charles Williams, the president of Xia He University. If the Johnson family was considered the local powerhouse, wealthy beyond words, then the Williams family wielded influence in both legitimate and underground circles, controlling half of Linhai City's social network with unstoppable power. The Johnson and Williams families were related by marriage and had been closely connected for years, with frequent interactions among the younger generation. Even without knowing Emily Johnson's identity, Charles Williams had already regarded her as a prize student. I quickly sifted through my memories, my face showing surprise while my heart sneered. What a perfect script for a male protagonist. Let's see how I bring you down.
Uncle Charles, David Brown just threw waste on a classmate.
Seeing Charles Williams arrive, Emily Johnson raised her voice a few notches.
Is that true?
I did throw it. You can play pranks, but I can't?
David, we can play pranks together, but why make everyone laugh at us? People might think you're bullying me.
Principal, I'm telling the truth. Yesterday, I overheard John Smith and Emily Johnson talking. John Smith said he thought Michael Williams' condition was fake, so he gave a bottle of tampered water to Emily Johnson, asking her to make sure Michael drank it. He even said it would take effect today. If that's not a prank, what is?
The air froze at my words. John Smith's face turned red and green, a sight to behold. Everyone knew Michael Williams was Charles Williams' only child, but due to his condition, he rarely left home. To keep him from becoming too isolated, Charles Williams had enrolled him in school and arranged a single dormitory for him. Emily Johnson, as Charles Williams' prize student, often visited Michael to tutor him. She was the only person besides family that Michael interacted with. Don't ask me why it's so illogical. This plot was designed by the male protagonist's system to connect John Smith and Michael Williams. Later, Michael Williams suddenly recovered overnight. Though he had no romantic feelings for the girl who helped him, he was grateful, which extended to John Smith as well. This was due to John Smith's special item, a system store tool called Wishwater. According to the previous timeline, last night, before the family dinner, Emily Johnson should have taken John Smith to see Michael Williams. First, to introduce her newly found ideal husband to her friend, and second, to borrow Michael's card for some spending money. After all, John Smith's attire wasn't cheap. Emily Johnson hadn't been officially recognized by the Johnson family yet, and the allowance she received wasn't enough to satisfy her material desires. John Smith took this opportunity to give Emily the wishwater, asking her to put it in Michael's food. The surveillance footage at Michael's dormitory entrance captured everything clearly. Charles Williams waved his hand and went to the security room to retrieve the footage. When he returned, his gaze at John Smith had completely changed, filled with a father's fury.
Security, arrest these two for tampering with food.
Principal! Principal! Uncle Charles, the water I gave Michael wasn't harmful. It was medicine to make him normal again.
You think this is a fantasy drama? If it wasn't harmful, why didn't you give it directly to the principal and had to sneak it in?
Charles Williams' face grew even more serious. He was anxious to check on Michael and didn't bother with John Smith, leaving in a hurry. I watched as security escorted Emily Johnson and John Smith away. They had arrived in such splendor, but left in utter disgrace. My inner monologue, serves you right. John Smith was too clever for his own good. He thought he was offering a lifeline, not hiding his actions at all. But how could he know that the Williams family treated Michael like their lifeline, never allowing him to consume anything suspicious? Just like an exam, even if the answer is correct, if the process is unreasonable, it's still wrong. In less than half a day, the incident had exploded on the campus forum. The poisoning incident involving Emily Johnson and John Smith had finally drawn the attention of the freshmen to the mysterious top student, Michael Williams. Michael had never shown his face, adding to his enigmatic aura. Compared to the courteous and popular second-ranked Emily Johnson, he seemed even more intriguing.
Our top student is actually battling a serious illness. That's incredible.
And he's handsome too. I saw a photo of Michael Williams once, and he looks like a Greek statue.
Really? If he weren't ill, John Smith wouldn't even stand a chance at being the campus heartthrob.
John Smith, a heartthrob? Please, the guy who walks with him is way better looking. John Smith is so fake. These girls are just fooled by him.
Michael Williams is the principal's son, and even more outstanding than John Smith. No wonder John Smith got jealous and did something so drastic.
A man more exceptional than Emily Johnson? I closed the forum, lost in thought. In my previous life, I hadn't witnessed John Smith's rise through the ranks, but I knew that Emily Johnson was only recognized by the Johnson family at 18 because the original heir had tragically died in a maritime accident. Although she was named the heir, many people were dissatisfied, questioning why an outsider should lead the Johnson family. On the other hand, Michael Williams, with a family background comparable to Emily Johnson's, was always cherished by the Williams family. Even when he was diagnosed with a severe illness at the age of 12, the entire family never gave up on him. Once Michael recovered, he quickly showcased his talents. Emily Johnson, on the other hand, relied on her marriage certificate to keep John Smith in check. But knowing John Smith's character, who valued his reputation above all else, he wouldn't be content with just being the Johnson family's son-in-law. The reason he gave Michael Williams that mysterious potion was likely not just to gain favor with Charles Williams, but also to access Michael's resources. If Emily Johnson knew she was just a stepping stone to be discarded, what would she do? 7 days later, it was the weekend again. I visited the detention center and looked at the unfortunate Emily Johnson in front of me, smiling from the bottom of my heart.
Emily, how are you holding up?
What do you think? Stuck in here because of John. I can't believe he would do this to me.
You know, Emily, sometimes people show their true colors when they're desperate.
True colors? He used me. And I trusted him.
Maybe it's time to think about a new beginning. Emily, you're stronger than you know.
A new beginning, perhaps.
As I left the detention center, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Emily Johnson had finally seen the truth, and maybe, just maybe, she would find a way to rise above it all. It had been 7 days since my last shower or hair wash, but Emily Johnson still looked at me with arrogance.
What are you doing here? Trying to drive a wedge between John and me? Humph. Don't think you can deceive me. I will never accept you.
I couldn't help but laugh.
Seduce you? Compared to John Smith, the true heir of the Xiao family, your value as an imposter doesn't seem that significant.
Emily's head snapped up, her eyes filled with uncertainty.
What did you say?
I said, you can't possibly still be unaware that John Smith approached you just to reclaim his heritage, can you?
I slowly dropped this bombshell. Emily's pupils trembled, and she instinctively clenched her fists. Seeing her reaction, I knew my guess was correct.
In my previous life, during my final days in the hospital, I learned that John Smith's protagonist system didn't awaken right from the start.
At the matchmaking event, John was dragged by Emily to get a marriage certificate, which activated and bound him to the system. The rules of this protagonist system were brutally simple. The host needed to continuously seize the fortune of those around them to receive system rewards and gradually become the ultimate protagonist. In other words, once this system awakened, the deeper the relationship with John, the more misfortune would befall that person. At best, they would lose their wealth. At worst, they would lose their life.
So, after being reborn, my first reaction was to prevent John from immediately awakening his protagonist system. That's why I snatched your household registration book.
Later, it proved that snatching the household registration book was not only highly insulting but also useless.
I tore off the mask and drove him out of our house. But after watching the surveillance footage at home and seeing John conjure a bottle of wish water out of thin air at the door, I realized he had already awakened his protagonist system.
After taking away my marriage prospects, whose fortune would John seize next? I suddenly remembered Emily's background.
In my previous life, John Smith's background was a mystery. Although he was considered the godson of a self-made millionaire, his status was still far below that of Emily Johnson, the sole heir of the Xiao family. After you and John got your marriage certificate, your identity was also questioned. However, later on, the Xiao family's attitude took a 180-degree turn. They simply let John, their son-in-law, take the position of CEO, while you, the eldest daughter of the Xiao family, were given a nominal but powerless vice president position.
That's impossible.
There was a rumor that you were not the lost child of the Xiao family. John was. I knew very well that in a world with a system, as long as the system altered some data, falsehoods could become truths.
During these 7 days, I specifically asked Mrs. Brown to have John's genetic similarity with Mr. Brown retested, and the results were vastly different from before. John turned out to have no blood relation to Mr. Brown at all. When Mrs. Brown went to return Emily's household registration book, the Xiao family's reaction also became very strange.
Thinking of this, I looked at you with pity and threw the household registration book back. This household registration book has been invalidated. Emily Johnson, your so-called status as a wealthy heiress is just a dream. And John Smith will only step on you and the Xiao family to climb up to Michael Williams' connections and resources to achieve his ambitious goals. He will never marry you.
Emily hastily took it, seeing only her own bare page left, and her composure shattered.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. John wouldn't do this to me. You must be trying to sow discord. Let me out. Let me out.
As she wished. In the afternoon, Emily Johnson was released from the detention center. She specifically asked John Smith about it, only to find out that he had been released 3 days earlier.
What? He was released 3 days ago?
Emily's face turned pale, and she quickly made a phone call as she stepped out. Shortly after, a black stretch Lincoln arrived to pick her up. Before leaving, Emily gave me a threatening look.
David Brown, you better not have lied to me.
I generously rolled my eyes at her. As I turned back, a crisp snap of fingers suddenly echoed in my ears.
Hello, nice to meet you.
A boy in white clothes stood behind me, smiling slightly.
I'm Michael Williams.
Michael was dressed in pure white sportswear, his features chiseled like a Greek sculpture, yet he had a pair of eyes that sparkled with a natural warmth. To me, he looked like a demon, and my heart was in turmoil. In just 3 days, Michael had returned to normal. John Smith's wishwater really worked. But shouldn't he be looking for John Smith? Why come to me?
Shall we talk?
We have nothing to talk about.
If we want to talk, there's always a topic. Like how you and John Smith turned me into a medical miracle.
I gasped, thinking of running away. Michael spread his hands.
I'm not joking. To thank you for speaking up, my father specifically asked me to invite you to a meal at the top floor restaurant of Xia He Tower.
Can I refuse?
Michael smiled innocently and handed me his phone.
Or maybe you'd like to chat with your mother.
On the screen, my mom was shopping at a supermarket, followed closely by 2 unfamiliar men. In an instant, one of the men nodded at the camera, and the scene switched to a video call.
No need!
With a bang, I quickly jumped into the passenger seat and fastened my seatbelt. Michael was momentarily stunned, then smiled and touched his nose before getting into the car. I kept a calm exterior, but inside, I was seething with anger.
What's so funny? Threatening people, acting like a big shot, being a gangster, is that impressive?
Sorry, but being a gangster is indeed impressive.
I was taken aback.
This guy, could he read my thoughts?
As you guessed, I have indeed awakened a mind-reading system. David Brown, you should thank me. Otherwise, with the lies you've told, you wouldn't be eating a meal later, but something much worse.
My body instantly stiffened, feeling as if I had fallen into an icy abyss. Michael approached me with a serious look on his face.
Can we talk now?
I nodded obediently.
John Smith has been taking leave for a week straight. Aren't you curious about the reason?
I replied nonchalantly.
Not really.
You're really not cooperative at all. Fine, John Smith has been detained by the police. The reason? It seems he's involved in an explosion case.
7 days ago, the explosion at the garden community in Linhai City shocked the entire nation. 17 people were injured, and 3 lost their lives. The epicenter of the explosion was right at my home.
According to the property management, at 10 p.m. that night, they had just finished feeding the cats and dogs of a certain household in the garden community. Shortly after they left, the house exploded. The property management immediately called the police.
The police identified the suspected arsonist through surveillance footage. When the image was enlarged, it was unmistakably John Smith's face.
Given the reputation of the Lin Hai-shao family's son-in-law, the police dared not make an arrest lightly. But secrets have a way of getting out.
This afternoon, a post appeared on the campus forum of Jinghai University, suggesting that John Smith was suspected of arson. The post included photos, timestamps, and witnesses. The evidence chain was detailed and convincing. It was even more comprehensive than the police's own findings.
I pulled a few strings. No need to thank me.
I glanced at him, expressionless.
Why aren't you surprised at all?
The Shao family will protect him.
Protect an arsonist?
What if it's their own son?
Michael's eyes turned cold for a moment.
I see. No wonder it's tricky.
I looked at him as if he were a monster.
Knowing that your future brother might be a criminal, is this really your reaction?
Narrator, tone. Sirius the Jinghai Building, the most renowned landmark in Linhai City, has fewer than 5 people who can book the top-floor restaurant. Charles Williams is one of them. Narrator, tone. Sirius I, David Brown, have a fear of heights and riding the outdoor elevator nearly scared me out of my wits. By the time I stepped out, my legs were trembling and numb.
Michael Williams, tone, friendly David, I've arranged for a wheelchair. It might be easier for you.
Narrator, tone. Serious though it felt particularly embarrassing, my body simply wouldn't allow me to walk upright. Narrator, tone. Serious upon entering the restaurant, I wasn't surprised to see an old acquaintance, John Smith. He wore his characteristic distant smile, like a finely crafted mask. When he turned to look at me, the mask shattered.
John Smith, tone, shocked David Brown. What brings you here?
Michael Williams, tone, polite Mr. Smith, please calm down. Mr. Brown is also a distinguished guest invited by my father.
Narrator, tone. Serious John Smith fell silent, his expression a mix of surprise and suspicion. I looked at the two of them, feeling even more puzzled.
David Brown, tone. Confused, is this how good friends greet each other?
Narrator, tone. Serious Michael Williams remained unfazed, pushing me along as he exchanged pleasantries with others. Suddenly, he leaned down and whispered in my ear.
Michael Williams, tone, whispering he really resents you. Just now, he was imagining using a wine glass to harm you.
Narrator, tone. Terrified, a shiver ran down my spine. I turned my head and met John Smith's venomous gaze, barely concealed behind his false smile. Narrator, tone. Serious, this banquet was primarily to celebrate Michael Williams' recovery. Many guests were invited, all of them industry giants and familiar faces from the news. Narrator, tone. Serious, during dinner, I noticed Emily Johnson squeezing into the banquet. However, her presence didn't seem to please the Johnson family. Meanwhile, John Smith was being treated like a star, surrounded by admirers. The difference in treatment was stark. Narrator, tone. Serious, our table was filled with younger people, including second-generation wealthy heirs, young entrepreneurs, and college classmates like me. Emily Johnson was also seated with us.
Michael Williams, tone, cheerful, I just remembered something. Do you all know about the fire at the garden community 3 days ago?
Wealthy heir, tone, serious, I've heard about it. The scene was quite tragic.
Young entrepreneur, tone, serious, it didn't seem like an accident to me. More like it was intentional.
Narrator, tone. Serious, John Smith took a sip of his drink, trying to hide his unusual expression. I sneered internally. So, you do feel a bit scared?
Michael Williams, tone, hopeful, I heard the explosion's epicenter was right at David Brown's home. How's your family?
Narrator, tone. Serious, all eyes turned to me. Oh, is this my chance to perform? I cooperated by showing a frightened expression.
David Brown, tone. Serious, my dad was lucky. He was out drinking that night and wasn't hurt. But when he came back, the house was gone.
Young girl, tone. Stun, that's quite a coincidence. Really lucky.
David Brown, tone. Cheerful. Even more coincidental is that my home surveillance footage is connected to the internet. Would anyone like to see it?
Narrator, tone. Serious, the people at the table exchanged glances, hesitant to take up the offer. Talking about the explosion was one thing, but actually watching the video was a bit too much.
Emily Johnson, tone, curious, are there any clues in the video?
Narrator, tone. Serious, John Smith immediately glanced at his so-called fiancée. Emily Johnson seemed oblivious and continued looking at me.
David Brown, tone. Serious? I'm not an expert, so I've handed all the video footage over to the police.
Narrator, tone. Serious, hearing this, John Smith's body trembled, and his gaze towards me was filled with urgency and resentment. Oh, that's anger. Narrator, tone. Serious, halfway through the meal, I excused myself to go to the restroom. When I looked up, John Smith appeared behind me like a ghost, his gaze complex and intense.
John Smith, tone, angry David Brown, do you really think you can bring me down? Don't forget, I have the entire Johnson family behind me.
David Brown, tone, serious, huh?
John Smith, tone, angry David Brown, what are you laughing at?
David Brown, tone, serious, huh?
John Smith!
Left alone in a state of confusion, John Smith stood there while I returned to my seat, lost in my own thoughts about what I had just said. Indeed, I truly wished for John Smith's downfall. With his cold and ruthless nature, as long as he had the protagonist's advantages, he would never spare me or my family. Of course, eliminating the protagonist was no easy task. I was well aware of that, especially now that the influential Johnson family in Linhai City had decided to protect him. As for the Williams family's stance, I glanced at Michael Williams. It was hard to decipher.
What's on your mind?
Michael's voice brought me back to the present.
Just thinking about our situation. John Smith won't let us off easily.
I know. But we need a plan. We can't just sit here and wait for him to make his move.
I nodded. Michael was right. We had to be proactive.
In the previous life, I was merely an ant under his feet, easily crushed. But this time, I've accelerated the plot on my own terms, avoiding the pitfalls. This has provoked the malice in John Smith's heart.
And now he's more dangerous than ever.
You have no idea. I was shocked when I saw the surveillance footage of him setting fire to the delivery box in the kitchen. He actually did it himself. In the previous life, even when my family was ruined, this beast hadn't acted directly.
That monster!
Emily Johnson had been willingly swayed by him. The fire in the apartment complex had been caused by a delivery box spontaneously combusting in the downstairs rental unit. My mother and I ended up in the slums, unable to find work, because Emily Johnson had taken it upon herself to inform the HR circle in Linhai City to blacklist us.
He's ruthless. But why does he hate you so much?
Only my demise would ensure that I posed no threat to him, and only then would he relent. Yet I still can't understand why. In the previous life, despite not treating John Smith poorly, he harbored such hatred towards me after years of brotherly camaraderie.
Years of camaraderie, and yet he wants you gone?
Yes, it's puzzling. But what puzzles me even more now is you, Michael. You were John Smith's former good friend.
Things change. People change. But you can trust me.
I looked into Michael's eyes, searching for any hint of deception.
I hope.
A month after the dinner gathering, news of John Smith being a suspect in the Garden Community arson case once again swept across the internet. Initially, the Smith family had managed to suppress the news. However, another rumor surfaced, claiming that John Smith was actually the long-lost eldest son of the Smith family. This rumor spread even more rapidly.
Did you hear about John Smith? The news is everywhere.
Yes, it's all over the internet. The Smith family's attempts to suppress it didn't last long.
Many media outlets subtly suggested that Emily Johnson from Jinghai University might be a mistaken heir, and that John Smith was the true lost gem of the Smith family. They also hinted that the Smith family was shielding a criminal. Overnight, public opinion exploded. John Smith went from being the Smith family's heir to a pariah, condemned by everyone.
I can't believe people are saying I'm not the real heir. This is so overwhelming.
Hold on, Emily. These are just rumors. We need to stay strong.
The school forum was flooded with posts insulting John Smith. Some radical netizens even staked out his usual routes, throwing rotten eggs and vegetables at him. Worse still, the Smith family's stock plummeted, and their corporate image suffered malicious damage. After a month of deadlock, John Smith was finally abandoned. The Smith family voluntarily handed him over to the police to face legal judgment.
It's a harsh world out there.
I watched with a mix of satisfaction and trepidation. Such a powerful media offensive clearly wasn't the work of ordinary outlets. There had to be a major player behind it. When I met Michael Williams again at the rooftop restaurant, I subtly brought up my suspicion.
Michael, don't you find it strange how fast and aggressive the media was with John Smith?
This is just a part of business warfare, David.
Business warfare? But why? Especially when John Smith's wish water saved you.
David, because you and I are both reborn.
Reborn? What do you mean?
In our past lives, I was drawn to his protagonist system and willingly became his accomplice, handling unspeakable tasks. In the end, I took the fall for him and was sent to prison. After my demise, I watched John Smith mercilessly force my father to sell all of our family's assets at a low price. His ambition is extraordinary. I won't make the same mistake in this life.
So, John Smith took everything from us. All our fortunes, my marriage, Emily Johnson's family background, and your family business. This is truly tragic.
What? Feeling sorry for me?
It's so unfair. How come you get a heart voice system after being reborn, and I get nothing?
David, you always know how to make me laugh.
I chuckle too, but the heavy stone in my heart remains.
That day, as I was leaving the school gates, my right eyelid kept twitching incessantly. It wasn't until I got into the taxi that I realized the driver looked eerily familiar.
David Brown, long time no see.
I discreetly pressed the emergency call button on my phone.
John Smith, aren't you supposed to be in detention?
I specifically exchanged a wall-passing tool from the system store to escape and find you. Aren't you touched?
I didn't dare move. I clamped my mouth shut, not wanting to provoke him.
Why aren't you talking? Are you trying to get someone to help you? Ah, David Brown, sometimes I really don't understand why everyone is always helping you. Emily Johnson is like that, and so is Michael Williams. Clearly, I'm the protagonist.
What happened to you, John?
Do you know who personally sent me to detention? It was Emily Johnson, the one who claimed to care for me. Why? I'm clearly the protagonist. You're just a minor character, so why does everyone revolve around you? I can't accept it, I can't.
Looking at his furious face, I felt a moment of disorientation. Before John Smith's protagonist system was bound to him, I had already noticed his abnormal obsession with others. Wherever he went, he couldn't tolerate it if everyone present didn't focus their attention on him.
At weddings, he had to outshine the groom. At funerals, he had to be more noticeable than the deceased.
But soon, John Smith realized that no matter how hard he tried to curry favor, he still didn't receive as much attention as I did.
David, you can't wear that outfit again. Several girls were secretly watching you at the classroom door. David, don't do so well on the professor's assignment next time. You were the only one in the group to get an A. David, don't work so hard on the gene project with Damon. Several foreign universities are already preparing to collaborate on this topic.
In the end, John Smith looked at me helplessly, half joking.
David, if I ever get married, I have to hide you somewhere no one knows. Otherwise, you'll definitely charm everyone out of my sight.
At the time, I thought he was joking. It wasn't until my past life's experiences that I realized he was serious.
John Smith is the kind of person who, as a student, wanted to be better than the best student in the teacher's eyes, who during military training had to outperform the most standard student in the instructor's group, and who at work had to make sure his superiors saw all his exceptional qualities. He would even get jealous of a lion at the zoo because it could command everyone's attention just by lying there.
I used to think it was something I did wrong that made him hate and envy me so much. After living through 2 lifetimes, I now fully understand. John Smith is indeed troubled.
Under John Smith's frantic driving, the car quickly crashed into the roadside guardrail. I clearly heard the crisp sound of bones breaking. Is this it? Am I really going to perish this time?
Well, I have no regrets. Mrs. Brown is still doing well, whether or not she wants to divorce Mr. Brown. The insurance and funds I left for her are enough for her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. As for me,
Being taken in an accident is a common fate for a minor character. A flash of white light, and everything in my vision shattered, including John Smith's twisted, crazed face. I chuckled softly and closed my eyes peacefully. I don't know how long my consciousness floated in the darkness before a beam of light suddenly swept over me. Snap. Patient heartbeat.
David.
I woke up with a start. Mrs. Brown was crying beside me, her face streaked with tears. Seeing me awake, she hugged me excitedly.
David, you finally woke up. You scared me to death. I almost thought you were going to end up like John Smith, in a vegetative state.
Hearing this, I was once again shocked. What is going on? Isn't John Smith the protagonist? How did he end up worse off than me in this accident? I couldn't figure it out. After a week of rest, I left the hospital bed and finally went to see John Smith. John Smith had become a vegetable. To be precise, he was paralyzed. He lay in the hospital, unable to move, his eyes filled with sharp hatred as he looked at me.
David Brown, you wretch! How could you do this to me? I will never let you go. I'm the protagonist, and you're just a minor character. With a flick of my finger, I can destroy you.
I observed him for a moment and then took out my phone to call Emily Johnson.
Miss Johnson, your fiancé seems to have lost his mind. Aren't you going to come and see him?
Emily Johnson quickly arrived at the hospital, her expression anxious.
John, what's wrong?
Seeing his fiancée, John Smith restrained his emotions. His handsome yet pale face looked weak, and the slight redness around his eyes made him appear pitiful.
Don't let David Brown appear here, okay, Emily? I don't want to see him right now.
Emily Johnson looked heartbroken, her eyes filled with tears. She bent down to embrace her lover, but suddenly let out a scream. Emily Johnson crouched down in pain, clutching her ears, blood seeping through her fingers and dripping onto the not-so-clean floor. John Smith's mouth was full of blood, his previously fake expression replaced by a sinister grin.
Emily Johnson, you lied to me, and you dare to come see me. I want to eat your flesh and drink your blood.
Doctors and nurses quickly arrived, administering a sedative to John Smith and helping the nearly fainting Miss Johnson out of the room. John Smith continued to curse, his voice growing weaker and weaker.
Don't touch me. Where's my protagonist system? Come out and save me. Save me.
I watched calmly and then turned to leave without any emotion. No wonder. John Smith had gone mad. A system wouldn't bind to a mentally unstable host, especially not the protagonist of a romance novel.
Finally, everything settled. I heard that after John Smith woke up, he struggled for a long time. Under Emily Johnson's care, his condition worsened until he became completely unresponsive.
John, I'm here. I'll visit you every week, no matter what.
Despite her unwavering devotion, John Smith's health did not improve.
I have some news. I'm pregnant.
Emily, we were ready to give up on John, but your tears swayed us. You must bring us a grandson.
Emily made weekly trips to the hospital, hoping for a miracle.
John, I'm carrying our child. Stay strong for us.
But despite the system's support, John Smith's vegetative body couldn't be restored. He ultimately passed away in his hospital bed.
John, no. Please, wake up.
Emily held her child and wept bitterly as night fell. The city lights began to shine from the top floor of Xia He Tower, offering a panoramic view of the nightscape. I sat on an outdoor sofa, took a sip of red wine, and felt utterly content. I unlocked my phone, and a floating window popped up with a news headline. Johnson family's son-in-law passed away this morning. Princess Emily Johnson fainted 3 times while holding the coffin. The comments section was filled with elegies for the ill-fated couple. I smiled. The male lead was obsessive enough, and the female lead was deeply affectionate. How could this not be considered a perfect love story? But for us minor characters, it's better to honestly enjoy this simple and mundane life. In this lifetime, I want to stay with my family and live our days well. Satisfied, I closed my eyes and let my consciousness drift into sleep. Moments later, a cold, mechanical electronic voice abruptly sounded in my mind.
Ding, NPC self-awareness successful.